Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are cracking open a stack of source material that is, I have to say, intensely provocative.
It really is.
It challenges nearly every conventional idea we have about, fundamental gender differences.
Yeah, and this isn't just about biology, which I think is what people expect.
Not at all. We are going deep into the wiring of cognition, emotional priorities, and what the material claims is.
Well, evolutionary destiny.
It's an ambitious mission, for sure. The sources we've gone through propose that these fundamental differences, they all come down to how men and women use their brains.
Right.
And that one difference, it governs their entire approach to life. The analysis draws a really sharp line.
Okay, so what's the line?
It's one approach focused almost entirely on the concrete, the material world. The other is much more oriented toward the mental and, this is the critical part, the spiritual world.
And we are not going to bury the lead here. The whole premise of this deep dive is built on the source's most surprising claim.
It's a big one. That, from a purely evolutionary standpoint, women are, in fact, the more advanced sex. I mean, that is a massive claim. Okay, let's unpack this. Where do they even start to build that argument?
They start right at the source, the neural architecture.
Yeah.
The entire argument is built on what the sources call the cognitive split.
The cognitive split.
Yeah, the idea that almost all behavioral differences come from which parts of the brain are being prioritized for, just daily processing.
So, okay, let's look at the male profile first then. The material says male behavior is heavily weighted, maybe even dominated by the left brain.
Exactly, the left brain.
And this is where we get those stereotypical traits we associate with success, right? Logic, spatial reasoning, calculation, rationality.
All of it. When the left brain is in the driver's seat, the behaviors that come out are highly focused, singularly purposeful, simple, and often silent.
Silent. That's interesting.
Well, the goal is clear, the path is direct. The focus is just on mastering the immediate tangible problem in front of you.
Okay, so if that's the male cognitive structure, very linear, very left-brained, how did the sources define the female structure?
It's completely different. The material posits that female behavior uses and integrates both hemispheres of the brain, much more dynamically.
Dynamically, so they're working together more.
Exactly. While the left brain is still handling the necessary logic, processing reality, the right brain is fully engaged. And that right brain, the source argues, that's where emotional connection, spiritual pursuits, and that kind of integrated abstract thought resides.
Okay, wait, I need to pause on that claim for a second. You said the sources suggest these emotional and spiritual pursuits are higher than those of men. Why? What makes one approach evolutionarily higher?
That's the key distinction, and it's easy to misunderstand. They define higher not as better in a moral sense, but as more complex, more adaptive to future non-material environments.
Ah, okay.
The right brain deals with things that are invisible, abstract. It requires deep pattern recognition, like interpreting emotion, seeking beauty, showing strong sympathy and compassion.
So these are behaviors that are less about solving the immediate, tangible problem.
Right, and more about optimizing the social and the internal state. They argue the ultimate direction of civilization is internal, making these skills fundamentally more future-proof.
That makes the immediate consequence of this split very, very clear then. Men are prioritizing reality, the material world, because that's their left brain focus. Their job is to secure the foundation.
And women prioritize the internal, the spiritual, and the mental world because they integrate the right brain. And that makes them, in this model, the architects of our future direction.
That integration is why they claim women represent a more advanced evolutionary direction. It's about complexity and adaptation. But I can see how this leads directly to immense friction in, the most common human activity, communication.
Oh, absolutely. The biggest friction point.
Okay, let's explore that first major conflict point. The goal of interaction. Why are we even talking to each other?
For the male profile, it is fundamentally highly purposeful. The goal is always explicit, to persuade someone, to provide information, to give an output, or to solve a very specific, defined problem.
It's a transaction.
In a way, yeah. If you listen to men in conversation, the logic follows a strong, linear cause and effect path. A leads to B leads to C.
So I start with A, I have to end with B, and every step in between has to connect logically. But the sources describe female communication as, well, the exact opposite.
It is. The material argues that for women, communication is often for the sake of communication itself. The process is the goal, not the solution.
The process is the goal.
Yes, the main objective isn't to solve the linear problem, but to achieve a state of shared emotional understanding. The sources use a specific term for this, gongqing, which is basically empathy.
Achieving empathy, whether or not the actual problem got solved, that completely reframes the entire purpose of having a conversation. This has to be the root of that disconnect everyone talks about.
It is. The sources describe female communication as involving jumping thoughts.
Jumping thoughts.
Yeah, the literal translation of the idiom is to say whatever comes to mind. So, to an outside observer, it seems nonlinear, unpredictable, maybe even irrelevant to the original topic.
And for a man who's rooted in that linear, purposeful logic,
Right.
how does the source describe his experience of that?
They find it extremely painful.
Wow, painful.
Extremely painful and difficult to keep up with. I mean, if you're programmed to find the logical solution from point A to point B, being forced to jump to C, then maybe back to a variation of A, then suddenly over to D, it is mentally exhausting. It undermines the whole point of the conversation for him.
That brings up a practical question about skills then. The source notes that women's aptitude for expression and language is often superior, and this must be why.
Correct. That focus on the complexity of the process builds those muscles. That proficiency in language and social decoding helps explain why women tend to dominate people-centric fields, like service industries, where understanding and navigating emotional states is the primary job, not necessarily, spatial logic.
So what does this all mean for just, like, being popular? It suddenly clarifies why the rare men who have high emotional intelligence are often so popular.
Yes.
They're the ones who can actually track those jumping thoughts, find the emotional logic that's hidden in the narrative, and hit those empathy points. They're fulfilling the real goal of the conversation from the female perspective.
Precisely. They are, for a moment, adopting that holistic, right-brain processing mode to navigate the conversation. They're cracking the code.
Let's follow that thread from communication to connection itself. We have to talk about emotional needs, and especially how the sources tackle that huge cultural stereotype around male fidelity.
Right. This is an area the material is very, very specific about. It addresses the concept of the hooksin, the playboy, or the unfaithful male head-on.
Okay.
And the conclusion is pretty stark. The perceived lack of fidelity doesn't come from needing more connections, but because their need for emotional connection is, and this is a quote, low to an outrageous degree.
Low to an outrageous degree. That sounds like the source is basically arguing that men are fundamentally less emotionally complex. How are they measuring that?
It's measured by criteria. The source claims that the male profile often only requires one extremely specific, simple criterion in a partner.
Just one.
It could be height, it could be skin color, a specific physique, a single personality trait. If that one box is checked, the emotional requirement is, for the most part, satisfied.
And it's that extreme simplicity that leads to the perception of being unfaithful, because they can find that one simple thing in multiple places.
That's the argument. It's a staggering simplification of attraction, I know, but it's rooted in that left brain purposeful simplicity we talked about. Find the single input needed to solve the problem.
Whereas the female profile is totally different.
Fundamentally different. Women are seeking a holistic view. They're emphasizing the overall whole, the integrated person. This has to include abstract things like their spiritual state and complex things like their material security.
Which is why the sources say women are typically more dedicated. Their feelings just take more time and a deeper foundation to build, reflecting that complex whole brain architecture.
Yes. And this profound difference in criteria, simple input versus complex integration, creates huge conflict when relationships start progressing toward commitment.
I can imagine.
The sources outline two completely different models of how a relationship should progress. For the female view, relationships are almost always a linear progression.
Okay, so like, acquaintance leads to dating.
Which, if it's successful, moves toward marriage. Marriage is the ultimate, final, defining form of the relationship. It's the destination.
And for the male view, it's not linear at all, is it?
Not at all. For men, the source argues, relationships are a set of parallel states. Acquaintance, dating, marriage. They're all seen as parallel conditions that, theoretically, could exist at the same time with multiple people.
So there's no single ultimate destination required in their model.
Exactly. They're just separate transactions for different emotional needs, even if society, prevents them from acting on that parallel structure.
That linear versus parallel approach to commitment is a huge divergence. It really speaks to their cognitive mandates. One is building toward an ultimate end state. The other is focused on maximizing parallel resources.
Okay, let's shift now to the material world, to survival. The sources challenge a really common idea that women are more realistic.
Oh, that is a common one.
It is, but they argue that reality is fundamentally about survival, and survival has always been tied to the material basis.
Which leads us straight to the historical male mandate. Their primary social duty was ensuring the species continued by securing the material base. Food, shelter, physical security.
And that required an absolute focus on the immediate, tangible reality. It drove the evolution of stronger bodies and survival skills geared toward the outside world.
Their whole focus had to become profit, benefits, power, security.
Yes, this is the very basis for that traditional cultural stereotype, which in Chinese is often summed up as Cheng Ji Liye, Yi Ji Wei Guo.
Which translates roughly to establish a family and a career and defend the family and the nation. The focus is all on physical establishment and protection, the material domain.
Precisely. And this historical mandate, the sources say, explains a major source of modern conflict. When women pursue these traditionally male objectives, money, power, external authority, men feel an intense sense of crisis.
A crisis.
Material calls it an invasion of their social duty.
That framing is really powerful. It suggests a man's feeling of being needed is directly tied to his ability to secure that material base. So when women become self-sufficient there, it's not just competition.
It's a threat to his core identity, his very purpose.
And on the flip side, for women, pursuing those goals is just an expression of self-worth. It's totally disconnected from that ancient mandate.
And this is where the source makes its most potent point about how we value female skills right now.
Which is that the female cognitive advantage, the mental and spiritual pursuits, they're being marginalized.
Yes, critically, because mental and spiritual pursuits don't currently yield substantial real-world material benefits. They don't instantly generate wealth or territory. The sources say this female advantage is being Hua, marginalized. They use a very specific analogy for its perceived value. Chalet.
Chalet chicken ribs. That's a fascinating term.
It means something that has some flavor, but it's not worth the effort required to eat it. There's just not enough meat on the bone.
So the analogy is that our societal reward systems, which are still based on that male material mandate, view women's holistic spiritual intelligence as existing, but ultimately having, negligible return on investment right now.
Exactly. It's a luxury, not a necessity for survival in the current model.
So you can see this evolutionary divergence so clearly in specific physical capabilities too, like spatial sense. That's entirely material-based.
Absolutely. Men have a vastly stronger spatial sense, which was non-negotiable for organized hunting. You had to map geography, terrain, prey location.
Yeah.
It was a life-or-death skill.
And because women's ancient roles were focused on the immediate, secure, domestic area production, gathering, raising children, their need for those long-range spatial skills just atrophied.
Right. The skill set wasn't required for survival within their mandate. And that leads directly to the modern issues the source points out, like easily getting lost or confusing directions. It's a clear functional divergence driven by the material needs of survival.
This brings us to a really deep-seated emotional response that seems genetically hardwired. The profound weight of failure. The source material suggests men genetically reject the very idea of being a failure.
Yeah, the material traces this all the way back to the immediacy of ancient male life. A hunting failure wasn't just, a disappointment. It was an immediate existential crisis.
No food meant the potential death of the group.
Right. And this intense, acute fear of being labeled a failure is still, as they put it, carved into the genes. It manifests as deep shame or existential dread today.
So if a modern man has a professional or a financial failure, the source is saying he's basically experiencing an ancient, life-threatening survival panic.
That's the idea. And this leads to some really important counterintuitive practical advice from the source. When a man is struggling with failure, avoid comforting words like, "Oh, failure isn't scary, just try again."
Why? That seems like the right thing to say.
Because that language actually makes the issue worse by just reminding him of the failure itself.
So what's the recommended approach then?
The best response is simply to give him quiet, undisturbed space. The core problem is the feeling of being an incompetent provider, which cuts right into that ancient survival fear. He needs time alone to reboot his left brain logic and plan his next move without the added pressure of emotional processing.
And the female contrast is that their response to failure is less severe, precisely because their ancient roles like production, child-rearing, they had longer cyclical consequences. A crop failure or a sickness was a long-term problem, not an immediate one-day threat.
That is the key difference. Men's constant confrontation with the immediate threat of death facing a stronger, hostile beast every day and needing to kill it to survive, that led to the high, unstable, and acute emotions often seen in ancient males facing a crisis. The survival mechanism had to be sharp, focused, and immediate.
It's a really phenomenal framework for contextualizing modern relationship friction and communication challenges, all through the lens of ancient differential survival stress.
Absolutely. When we synthesize all this data, we see that the development of civilization is blurring these rigid historical roles. And this necessarily causes intense collisions between the male material mandate and the female holistic integration.
But these collisions, the sources don't see them as a problem to be solved with compromise.
No. They describe it as a necessary process, a process to remove impurities and force adaptation from both sides.
So we circle back to the main thesis. While the source acknowledges that male-led society emphasizes competition, war, rapid material development, making it fast but inherently unstable, the ultimate conclusion holds.
That women are the more advanced species.
So what does this all mean for the future?
The final analysis all hinges on the destination of human endeavor. The material argues, unequivocally, that the material world, the world men were mandated to secure, is only the necessary foundation.
Only the foundation.
The spiritual world, the domain of emotional integration and abstract thought, is the inevitable future direction of civilization.
That reframes the entire discussion. It moves the focus away from current conflict and toward future evolution. And here is a final provocative thought from the sources for you to consider, connecting that female spiritual focus back to the very foundations of human belief systems.
It's a fascinating piece of cold data they drop at the end.
The earliest gods were almost exclusively female. So if the spiritual domain is humanity's future, what does that historical, universally acknowledged fact suggest about the ultimate, inevitable direction of human evolutionary ascendancy?